Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to assemble something a little bigger than I would normally do. This German King Tiger Ardennes front version made by Tamiya. Is it pronounced Tamiya or Tamiya? My brain always wants to say Tamiya, though it's probably wrong. I will use both pronunciations interchangeably, that way I can bug people on both sides of the fence. Haha! Anyway, this is a 1/35th scale plastic kit, which is much bigger than the 28 and 15mm scale models I normally work with. As you can see, there isn't anything of interest on the back of the box unless you're into brownie grey cardboard, I guess. I can't say that I am. I do quite like the artwork on the front of the box. They've knocked out a Sherman and the commander is shouting down to the motorbike guy, "Lol, go tell Hitler." The tiny text on the front of the box here says that this kit includes two types of gun mantlet, options for open or closed hatches for the turret and hull, including the escape hatch, and it also includes a DKW NZ350 motorcycle, as well as 3 lifelike figures. Enough rambling, let's look inside. As you can see, there is quite a lot of stuff in this box. Buckle in guys, this is going to get rough. This is probably going to be a long one. So, what's actually here? There is this warning sheet letting us know how badass and dangerous this hobby is, an instruction sheet for assembly of the included motorcycle, a paint and decal guide showing a few different paint and marking schemes which I'm assuming are probably reasonably accurate if you want to model those specific tanks. This would be better if it was in colour, but it's still a nice inclusion anyway. There is also this huge instruction leaflet. It is 5 double-sided pages and quite in depth. I would have much preferred if they cut the pages and stapled them together so it worked a bit more like a book. It would be much easier to handle, though this isn't too serious an issue, at least not for me. And of course decals are included with a mildly amusing oversized piece of protective paper. These decals look pretty good and there is a nice variety of choices for marking the tank and motorcycle. There is of course more than just paper and decals in this box. There is also a lot of sprues and this, the upper hull. Not really a sprue, more a big chunk of plastic. It's quite neat and well detailed. I really like that you can see weld marks moulded into the plastic. I'm more used to working with much smaller models, so this is quite unusual for me. The detail on the hull joints is really quite nice too. Having recently worked on a much lower quality model, the lack of obscene mould lines and flash really pleases me too. We also have another big chunk of plastic. This is of course the lower hull. It's still pretty well detailed, though there isn't really much on the lower hulls to begin with anyway. This is Sprue A. There are 2 of these in the box. They contain all the wheels, sprockets, suspension arms, and exhausts. All very neat, error-free, and nicely detailed. Sprue B here contains all the spare track links and the brackets you would use to mount them to the side of the turret. My immediate reaction to seeing the colour of these was horror, thinking they would be the same rubbery vinyl stuff that the main tracks are made from. Fortunately, that was not the case. Sprue C is the biggest of the lot. It contains all manner of tank bits like vent covers, cables, tools, hatches, a machine gun, the side skirts, gun components, and the rear of the hull. It also has some teeny tiny headphones for the tank commander for when he wants to rock out. He probably listens to Manowar. Sprue D contains almost entirely turret parts. The turret itself is just as excellent as the hull. I'm really enjoying the weld markings. They're even in the little gaps between the roof panels. There's also a bunch of internal ammo racks. The turret does have some interior detail. No ammo to go on those racks though, unfortunately. We also find one of the crew figures on this sprue. This looks like the commander. He's got a little bit of flashing, but otherwise he looks pretty good. He's got a bit of a smile. Obviously enjoys cruising around in a King Tiger. Sprues X and Y contain parts for the motorcycle. I'm not sure how many bikes can be built. It does look as though there are enough parts for almost 2 whole bikes. Perhaps one is stowage. Sprue X also contains the alternate gun mantlet. Sprue Z contains 3 figures, so it would seem you get a 4th despite what the box says. Not that I'm complaining. These parts do look good, though they have significantly more flash than any of the straight non-organic parts, so they will need a bit of work to clean them up. Not a huge problem really. There is also this little bag with 4 polycaps, mesh for the air intake screens, double-sided tape, and a screw and nut that will be used to secure the gun into the turret. And finally, these vinyl tracks. I make my disdain for these no secret, though they aren't particularly bad looking. The trouble is when you put them on the model, it is hard to get them to sit realistically. I did look for some aftermarket individual tracklink sets, but they were a bit expensive. Might wait and see how I feel about it after I get the tank built. Well, that was a lot of bits to look at. Let's get to work on this beastie. The first step, as outlined by the instructions, is to assemble some wheels, sprockets and idler wheels. I start by assembling the road wheels. They all have part A9 in common, so I cut out all of the A9s, clean them up and set them aside. There wasn't a whole lot to clean up, just tiny burrs left after clipping them from the sprue and a very faint mold line that I scraped off. Then I cut out all of the part A8s to make 10 of wheel type A. This is incredibly simple, just glue part A8 and A9 together like so, making sure that the detailed side with the bolts on part A9 will face outwards. This is what you should end up with, and there should be a pile of 10. These are the inner road wheels. Next, I clip out all 8 of part A11 with its shorter axle protrusion thingy and then repeat the previous assembly process until you have 8 wheels. These are obviously the outer road wheels. Now to make the sprockets. Take parts A10 and A7, being careful not to cut the sprocket teeth off when removing them from the sprue. There was a bit of a mold line on these parts that I didn't bother cleaning up. The tracks will hide most of it and it shouldn't be too noticeable. We also need one of these polycaps for each sprocket. I'm not really sure why these are needed, but apparently they are, so in it goes. Then the two halves of the sprocket can be glued together. The parts are keyed, so they will only go together a certain way. This means you don't need to worry about getting the teeth aligned with each other. Next, we make the idler wheels. These comprise of parts A12, into which the polycap is inserted, and onto which we glue part A15. Then A16 is glued onto that. All these parts went together very easily and are keyed, so the spokey parts all end up being straight. There we have it. At the end of step 1, we have all the wheels needed for a King Tiger. Onwards to step 2. We start this by removing from the sprue all of the approximately 7 billion suspension arms. They are all part number A19, so you don't need to worry about mixing up parts for the left and right side of the hull. These parts are all quite neat and the mold line is barely noticeable. The spots where I've clipped the part off the sprue are obvious, but I'm not going to waste time cleaning them up. They won't be visible without extreme effort anyway. The way these attach to the hull is simple. The shorter, thicker end goes into the hole in the hull, like so. The raised nub engages with the groove in the back of the suspension arm and prevents it moving more than the tiniest bit. It is very quick and easy to glue all of these into place. If you're paying attention to the instructions, you'll notice that the suspension arms are oriented in a different direction on the left and right sides of the hull. This is because the torsion bar suspension is staggered. I'm sure someone else has a better explanation for this than me. Go look it up, it'll be interesting. Next, we want to install part A18, which holds the idler wheels in place. This part is the same for both sides of the hull. It is keyed, so it is very easy to glue it into place correctly. Like the suspension arms, this won't be visible and thus needs no cleanup. Next, we attach these. Not sure what you might call these, but they seem to be part of the final drive or the side of the hull, or something like that. This is part C45, which goes on the left side of the hull, or the right side if you're looking at it upside down like this. Part C44 goes on the opposite side. These barely need any cleanup before being glued into place like so. There is a little bit of a gap on either side of these parts, but it shouldn't be noticeable at all. Next comes the rear of the hull. Very neat. There is a minor mold line around the edge, but it won't be visible, so all I did was clean up the sprue removal marks. It just slots very easily into place like so. There is a gap along the bottom of this part. The two higher ones on the side will be hidden by the mudguards, but I will probably fill the bottom one with green stuff. Now onto the second half of the second step. Before we can attach any wheels, we need to first attach the end of the final drive. This is part A15. It didn't need much cleanup and will barely be visible if at all. Both of these parts are identical, so it doesn't matter which side you glue them onto. The fit is quite good. There's a lot of detail here that will be more or less invisible. Now for the wheels. They go on like so. I'm planning to partially paint the wheels separately, so I will be gluing the inner road wheels on, but not the outer ones. This means that I can't glue the idler wheel into place because the rearmost outer road wheel will not go into place if the idler wheel is in place. They need to be installed at the same time, so I will need to paint both the outer wheels and the idler wheel separately. The same problem exists with the drive sprocket, so I will be leaving all of those off until the model is painted. There are also these hub things that extend out from the inner wheels. I checked to see if this will interfere with the positioning of the outer road wheels, and it looks as though it won't. This is a good example of why test fitting is important. Once I'm satisfied with how everything will go together, I glue the inner road wheels on, making sure that they are on the correct way. The slightly raised center hub part on these should be facing outwards. The inner side looks obviously different. I then attach the hub things to the inner road wheels, giving them a twist to make sure the glue is spread around nicely. There we go, inner road wheels only. The hull is just going to look a bit silly for a while. I also glued the hub thing things into the outer road wheels after test fitting to be sure it wouldn't impede with the installation of these wheels. I figure doing this now removes the risk of losing those parts later. In step 3, we're going to add some detail to the rear of the hull. I started this by making 2 exhausts using parts A3 and A4. This is pretty easy and I don't worry too much about how neat the lower half of this assembly will look. I just trimmed the small mold lines off the exhaust pipe itself. The lower parts will be hidden by covers. To finish this part, I add a tiny drop of glue and slide part A6 over the exhaust pipes. This is a tiny little detail, but I think it's quite a nice one. When you've assembled both exhausts, they can be glued into the 2 round openings on the rear hull plate. These are keyed, so they can't be installed wrong without some effort, though I don't know why you would want your exhausts on upside down. Next, I take these bracket things, part A1, and glue them into place in the lower rear of the hull. Make sure you install them the correct way up. The angled part should line up with the angle of the hull. Make sure they are nice and straight, and there you have a nice holder for your jack. What a luxury. The instructions tell us that there are still more details to add at this point, but I'm going to leave them off for painting later. They are parts A2, which are these tools on the right. They are used in joining and unjoining the track, and part C28, which is the jacking block, which is a block used for jacking. It will look better if these parts are painted separately, so they will be left off for now, and I will continue on my merry way into step 4, in which a jack will be made. For this we need parts C6, C9, which is the main jack body, and C10, the handle. The parts did need a little bit of cleanup, but nothing too serious. The jack is fairly simple to assemble and goes together like so. It looks very jack-like if you ask me. Normally, the jack would be glued into place here, but I'm going to put it aside and paint it separately. You may be beginning to sense a pattern here. Next, I'm going to attach the exhaust cover things. These are parts C29 and C30. They look very similar, but C29 obviously has these 2 brackety things on it. Minimal cleanup was required for these, then we can glue them right into place. You can see the mounting holes for these, and thus the guide pins are configured differently. This ensures that you put the correct exhaust cover on the correct side. The one with the brackets should be on the right. Next, I attach the rear mudguard parts, which have some nice hinge detail on them. These are parts C42 and C43. C42 goes on the tank's left. These are very simple to attach. Moving along to step 5. This is where we are meant to make the mesh covering for the air intakes. I believe these are for stopping mines and grenades being placed between the turret bustle and the engine deck, which is a place you don't really want explosions. The instructions also tell us how to connect the tracks, but I'm obviously going to leave them off until painting, so I'm not going to bother with that yet. Who knows, I may change my mind about aftermarket tracks by the time I go to paint this tank. The instructions include a template to be used when cutting out this fabric. Cut it out as carefully and neatly as you can. I used the corners of the fabric to get straight edges, assuming the fabric has been cut straight to begin with. This was annoying, and it would have been much easier if this was pre-cut, but I guess that would remove some of the cost-cutting aspect, wouldn't it? It would obviously be best if this was made with etched brass or something. The shapes I cut out were close, but not perfect. Test fitting them into the frames, parts D13 for the left and D12 for the right, I realised they will need a little bit of trimming in order to not look horrendous, fiddly and annoying. If I was giving a score, I would deduct points for this. To attach the mesh to the frames, I put some superglue on a scrap surface and used a toothpick to apply small amounts of the glue along the bottom straight edge of the part. I didn't feel like trying to cut out the included double-sided tape to fit. I hold the mesh down over the glue, being careful to keep the straight parts lined up neatly. Once this is secured, we can better see how much trimming we need to do to the curved part of the mesh. I then carefully trimmed the curved edge down with scissors. It was a massive pain in the dick, but I didn't want to use a knife and gouge into the plastic. It probably would have stretched and pulled at the fabric too. Either way, I got it done with scissors. Not perfectly of course, but done. This end will mostly be hidden by the turret anyway. I then apply superglue to the curved edge of the frame, again using a toothpick. I used this because I didn't want to apply way too much like I probably would have with the bottle. I then press the mesh into the glue and hold it until it sets. This process is of course repeated for the sides of the part. Maybe the double-sided tape would have been a little bit less fiddly, but I probably would have found a way to mess it up. The result I got wasn't too bad, though it certainly isn't perfect. I feel this is the weakest part of the model. I'm actually tempted to leave these off. I will see how they look during painting to decide, I think. This step also included adding these periscopes into the upper hull. These are part C49 and they didn't need much cleanup at all before being glued into place. In fact, only the very top of them will be visible at all. When installing these, be sure you have the angled end on the inside of the tank. The flat end protrudes outside of the hull. There are two of these. This is the machine gunner's and it goes on the right side of the tank. The driver's obviously goes in front of his hatch on the left. Now on to step 6, in which we shall introduce the upper and lower hulls to each other. It also says to attach some shackles, but I'm going to leave that for another step in which more of the same part are added. Of course, test fit this before gluing. You always should, but this is a fairly major step and you don't really want to mess it up now, do you? The instructions recommend using sticky tape to hold the parts together, but I'm not going to bother with that. I apply glue and then join the parts together and hold them together until I'm confident the glue is setting. The parts fit together well enough, though not absolutely perfect. Most of the problem areas were at the rear of the hull. This big gap here could have been fixed by pressing down on the hull a bit more, but that would have created big gaps here where the rear plate joins the hull sides. Where the gaps are now will be conveniently hidden by the side skirts, which is a much better option than big gaps on the hull rear. Step 7 will have us pre-assembling some detailing parts. First, a headlamp. This comprises of parts C15, C25 and C31. They all needed a little bit of cleanup, mostly to remove the burrs from the sprue. The parts do go together quite easily like so. They are keyed so they can't really be put on lopsided, though I did find it a little bit tricky to get the headlamp onto its base and facing straight ahead and staying level. Next comes the hull machine gun port, again consisting of 3 parts. C26, the dome, C52, which is this boxy thing with the ball mounting inside, and C54, the gun itself. I tried to find mold lines to clean up on the gun because they're usually obvious on parts like that, but I couldn't see any. Assembly is straightforward. Simply glue the boxy part into the dome part and then glue the machine gun barrel into the appropriate hole in the boxy part and we've got ourselves a nice machine gun port. Next we build the engine access hatch. For this we need part C1, which you will need to be very careful with when clipping from the sprue and cleaning it up. It's obviously very tiny and thin, therefore quite delicate. Also, we need part C38 for the hatch itself and 2 of C57. This isn't particularly hard to put together, just glue the 2 dome parts into place. I guess they're ventilator covers or something. The grab handle can then be glued in. You might find this tiny part fiddly and I definitely suggest using tweezers. Make sure the handle is relatively straight and that's it. Now we can move on to step 8, which involves adding a bunch of small details. I'm going to start with those that come from sprue A. Firstly, these tiny little hook things, part A17. They didn't need much cleanup beyond a little trimming along the bottom. They can be glued into place with their openings facing outwards in the angled slots on each corner of this plate that goes above the engine. I guess they are for lifting this plate off. Very tiny, fiddly parts. Definitely recommend using tweezers. Next, part A20, which is 4 of these big shackles. Minor mold line removal was needed. 2 of them go on the front here, which was actually part of step 6, but being a huge rebel, I left it until now. They kind of just slip onto their mounting point, though I found the front ones to be a little bit tight. Make sure they are sitting naturally like gravity is pulling down on them. The other 2 go on the rear of the tank here and here. Now our King Tiger can be picked up by a crane and put on a ship, or dropped on its enemies. Now for the parts from sprue C, starting with these hatches here. C17 goes on the right and C18 goes on the left. I clean them up and glue them both into place. They pretty much just slot right in. I have chosen to mount mine in the closed position, though they can of course be modelled open too. These need a handle, so here's part C4. Not very explosive, but it still needs to be handled with care. These are tiny parts. Simply glue them into place in the holes on top of the hatches. I used tweezers and applied the glue to the end of the handles, rather than into the holes. I figured it might result in a cleaner look. Make sure they are pushed all the way into the holes and standing straight. I really enjoy these tiny little details I don't normally get to see on my smaller scale models. Next, it is time to glue on the hull machine gun we assembled in the previous step. This is exactly as easy as it sounds. The part is keyed so it will always fit right. Simply slot it into place and we're now ready to mow down some of those pesky infantry. Now for a couple of much bigger components, the side skirts. Part C55 here goes on the left and part C5 goes on the right. These parts were very neat and all I had to do before attaching them was to remove the burrs left after their removal from the sprue. This part is unsurprisingly quite simple to attach. Apply glue down the side of the hull and then sit the part in place. Make sure the part is in the correct position and is as gap-free as you can make it. The part is helped into the correct position by the mounting points that would be nice and visible if you chose to omit the skirts. I was quite tempted to model my King Tiger without the side skirts, but I figured if I'm going to use those vinyl tracks, I will want the skirts to help hide them. I'm not sure if I'm going to have trouble installing the tracks with the side skirts already on, but that's a problem for future Herbert to worry about. If you wanted, you could very easily bend and dent these skirts to make the tank look like it had been banging into things and roughing them up. I would think the skirts become very damaged very quickly. I've chosen not to because my intention is to model a fairly new tank that hasn't seen a lot of combat yet. The instructions for this step also want me to apply some tools. These are part C14, which is a shovel that goes here at the front of the hull, part C33, which is some kind of bar or giant toothpick. It goes here, also on the left with its point facing rearwards, and part C53, which I'm fairly sure is the hand crank for starting this tank. That sounds like a really fun way to start your day. All of these will be set aside and painted separately. Step 9 also involves a bunch of parts that will be left off the model until painting time. They are C46, which is a set of tow ropes, and I believe gun cleaning rods. They will be placed on the side of the hull here. You can see why I would want to paint these separately. C47, which are some kind of bolt cutters or something. They belong here on the engine deck behind this fan. C48, which is a mighty hammer. It goes on the left here beside the driver's hatch. You never know when the driver will need to stop because it has suddenly become hammer time. And C50, which is an axe, for chopping. Probably wood, but also bad guys, I guess. It goes here on the right side of the hull. There are a couple of other parts to put on now. They aren't all being left off for painting. First, we have these parts, C13. These are protective covers for the hull periscopes. These parts needed next to no cleanup and were simple to glue in. They go here over the periscopes, which does make sense. Of course, tweezers are good for those of us with fat fingers. Now our vision devices will be protected from things. Hooray! Next comes this, which I believe is the cover for the ventilator for the driving compartment. It is part C56 and it goes into the circle guide provided between the two hatches. I then glue in the headlight assembly I built in step 7. It goes into the slot in the upper front plate. I found it a bit difficult to mount this straight, mostly because the headlamp assembly itself is a bit off. Probably not a huge deal, really. Something that might bug some people is there being no cable running down from the hull to the lamp. I will deal with that later. Another pre-assembled part can be glued into its place next. The engine hatch assembly. We could have obviously attached these at any point between step 7 and now, but this is the point at which the instructions say to do it, so I guess I will defer to their wisdom. Now I move on to step 10, more hull detailing. This includes the mesh air intake covers we had the joy of assembling in step 5, some more cables and gun cleaning poles, these being part C34, and C12, which I very smartly managed to break while removing a mold line. I very carefully glued it back together. I think I did it pretty well too, you can barely see the join. And this pole, part C32. I'm not entirely sure what it's for, but it sure is pole-like. All of these parts will be left off for painting, but they will eventually go on the tank like so. Cables and such on the sides. They obviously don't really like just sitting there without something to bond them into place. Anyway, the mesh screens go over the grills here, and also on the left, and the pole goes on the side of the hull here. There are 2 raised bits to help position it. There are of course a couple of bits here that need to be glued into place. C40, the fire extinguisher, which goes right here onto this raised part on the engine deck just behind the right fan. C58, which is some kind of ventilator cover or something. This goes into place on this raised round bit with the bolts. It is keyed so you don't put it on wrong. The flat edge should be above the engine door, obviously so the door can be opened. Then part C59 on the left and C60 on the right. They're very slightly different, though I'm not really sure what they are. More vent covers or something like that, I assume. C59 goes on the left of the tank and C60 goes here to the right. This is pretty much it for the hull. Yeah, I know mine looks rather incomplete, but it won't stay that way for long. Let's move on to the turret, which, if you've been paying attention, is step 11. I was tempted to build the interior of this tank and modelling a hatch or 2 open, but I decided against it, partially because of laziness, but also because there isn't really that much internal detail. There's none for the driver's compartment, and there aren't even any shells to go in those shell racks. Maybe next time I build a kit with an interior, I will use it. So, with that in mind, I'm going to build a minimal version of the gun breech assembly because we do still need that to hold the gun in place. The rest of the interior looks pretty simple to put together, so if you want to build it, you shouldn't need me to show you how it goes together. Don't let me stop you. I take parts C36 and C37, which are the gun breech parts. I glue them together. There are pins and guide holes to help you get a good fit with these. Just make sure the protrusion that the gun and mantlet assembly will attach to is aligned correctly. Next, I glue parts C23 and C24 together. These form the cradle, or whatever you might like to call it, that will hold the gun in place inside the turret. I leave these parts to bond properly for a while I'm cleaning up part D14, the bottom of the turret. When I say clean up the bottom of the turret, I mostly mean remove the burrs left after removing the part from the sprue and not much else. Of course, it is a good idea to see if it fits on the hull and rotates freely. Looks good to me. Now I'm going to join the gun breech to its holder. Trunnions? Is that the right word? Onions? Whatever it is. To join these parts, we take the screw and pass it through both the gun breech and holder. You can get most of the way there with hand tightening, but in order to stop the barrel from flopping about, you'll need to tighten it all the way with a screwdriver. There we have a good firm but still movable fit. Then this assembly can be glued to the turret floor, obviously with the breech facing inwards. The parts are keyed, so you would have trouble putting it in backwards anyways. I quite like this method of attaching the gun to the turret, though I can see it becoming quite annoying if the nut and bolt become loose over time. Now we are up to step 12, building the gun, but first we must make a choice. Do we want the smooth gun mantlet or the stepped one? If you're worried about this, consult the painting guide supplied with the kit. Certain tanks have different mantlets, so if you're hoping to paint a specific tank, then be sure to choose the correct mantlet. I'm just building a random King Tiger more or less. I'm not really interested in doing anything especially historically accurate. I like the smooth mantlet better, so I'm using that. So we have chosen the correct mantlet parts, in my case that is X7 and X8. The rest of the gun is made up of parts common to both versions, these being D25 here and the barrel itself, D1 and D2. These parts didn't need much cleanup at all. Are you sensing a pattern here? No, me either. Assembly is straightforward. The big end of the mantlet goes on here. The other end, part D25, goes in here like so. These parts are keyed for your convenience. They won't go together wrong unless you really want them to. The two halves of the gun go together quite easily, though you do have to be careful that you've got the parts sitting together properly, especially the front of the gun. You can't really rely on the guide pegs here. The muzzle brake will be a huge pain to fix if it's glued together all lopsided and wonky. We could now glue the gun into the mantlet, but I left it for a while, let the glue set up, and then carefully cleaned up all the small lines and gaps left behind from the joining process. I do this fairly carefully, but much in the same way as removing regular mold lines. I rotate the part a little bit as I'm doing this to avoid scraping flat spots onto the obviously round barrel. I neaten the opening in the muzzle brake carefully with a fine file. Keep going until all the lines are as gone as you can make them. If there are any gaps to fill, it makes sense to fill them all at the same time, so I would leave that until later, but I am fairly happy with the result I got with just scraping. There are a couple of rough patches and a ding or two, but nothing that I felt is worth the effort of filling. Let us now move to step 13, where we will assemble the body of the turret. This involves part D23, this is the turret front, and part D24, which strangely enough is the main part of the turret itself. It's really nicely detailed. The only problem I have with it is that I managed to leave a slight blemish when removing it from the sprue. No big deal though, looks like it might be hidden by spare track links. The turret goes together quite simply. The instructions say to glue the floor in first and then attach the turret front, but I've done it in reverse. I guess that mostly matters if you're including the turret interior, which I'm obviously not. The parts go together quite nicely. This is another area where the instructions suggest using sticky tape, but I didn't feel a need for it. Next, we take this teeny tiny handle, part C3, and this hatch, part D22. This is the loader's hatch, and you can see there is detail on the inside for those wanting to model it open. Of course, more parts will need to be added in that case, a locking wheel and 2 more handles in fact. I am modeling it closed, so all I need to do is glue the handle into the 2 holes on top of the part, again applying the glue to the part rather than flooding the hole with glue and using tweezers. Make sure the handle is on fairly straight and then the hatch can be glued into place. The opening for it should be obvious. Now our loader has something to slam when he's in a bad mood. Step 14 continues adding details to the turret, including the interior details for the escape hatch. Since I will be modeling it closed, I can just ignore most of that. I take part D11 here, which is obviously the hatch, and then I glue the internal part, D10, onto that. It isn't exactly required as it won't be visible, but it will help guide the hatch nicely into place when the part is glued on like so. We do of course need the hinge covery parts, whatever they are called. These are part A5. They're identical and they simply glue into place like this. I did have to hold them in place for a little while, but otherwise they go on with no issue. You might notice that there are 2 holes on the hatch. Those are for one of these tiny fellows, another part C4. Please insert explosive joke here. Add glue to the part, then use tweezers to carefully position it. Easy. Next, we can attach the commander's machine gun ring, which is part C7. There are holes in the cupola vision devices and nubs on the ring to guide its positioning, though it was still a little bit fiddly to get it into the right position. Then I add part C8. This is the part I mentioned a few weeks ago when I was sick. Nobody guessed what it was, so nobody wins the million internet points. They're all mine. Ha 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 ha. Anyway, it's some kind of hatch and it's simply glued into place here. It opens towards the left of the tank and so that's the side the hinges go on. Then we need to make a choice of ventilator parts. D15 is what I went with. It simply glues into place here, Again, there are holes and pins to guide the positioning. The other choice was part D7, which I believe is a cover for the ventilator and has a handle. I liked the look of this one better. Next, we need a whole bunch of these little black brackety things. They are part B1. They are racks for the spare track links and they can be glued onto the side of the turret. There are little recesses molded into the turret for exactly this purpose. This is pretty simple if a little bit fiddly. Use tweezers and take your time. If you want to make sure you've got them on properly, take one of the track links with the holes in it and test it out. Never not test fit things. Eventually, I got all 16 into place. I quite like these little hooks being separate parts. It allows you to have as many spare track links missing as you like without the tank looking bare and silly. Plus, you can leave the spare track links off and paint them separately, and the hooks will still be painted the same color as the turret. You might notice that there are still some small recesses molded into the turret. That is where we will attach these tiny little things. Part D3. These seem to be some kind of retaining lug or something for the spare track links. I would imagine that they are bolted down to this lug to stop them from bouncing around as the King Tiger wildly rampaged across the countryside doing jumps and such. And this takes us up to step 15, which I have already done a chunk of because it involves adding the brackets and lug things to the other side of the turret. I figured why not do all of the turret in one go. I'll continue with the spare track links theme and assemble a few sets of spare track links. They are comprised of parts B2 and B4 and they go together as easily as you might imagine. To get part B2 to sit at the correct angle, just lay the part flat on the desk and let gravity do the work for you. Or alternately, you could glue the parts together while hooked onto the side of the turret, but I saw no real need for that. I only made 5 sets of these out of the possible 8 that you can fit on the King Tiger's hooks, but you can make up to 16 sets of track links, which is pretty good. You could, if you wish, add extra spare track links in impromptu storage locations like strapped to the front of the hull or something. Otherwise, they're good to keep on hand for decorating dioramas or other tanks, or even to make a tool for pressing King Tiger tracks into surfaces. Next, I am going to attach all 3 of these lift rings, which are part A21. There is one spare on the Sprues, so feel free to lose one of these if you want. As with all the tiny pieces like lifting points and handles, I would highly recommend tweezers. 2 of these simply glue into place here on the front of the turret, and then we place the third towards the rear of the turret in the center. Make sure they're nice and straight and done. Now anyone that wants to can just come along with his crane and lift our turret right off. Now for this, the commander's hatch, better known as part C27. Wait, that's not right. It can be positioned either open, closed, or anywhere in between. I was quite tempted to have the commander standing up out of the hatch, but I decided to glue mine shut. I don't know why, I just prefer tanks to be buttoned down for some reason. Now the hatch isn't complete. If you were looking closely, you might have noticed 2 holes in the top of the hatch. Those are for this, part C2, which is obviously a tiny handle. Simply attach it to the hatch arm thingy here in the same way we've been attaching all the other handles. Carefully and preferably with tweezers and glue applied to the handle rather than the mounting holes. Make sure it's pressed all the way in and it's done. Next, we're going to give the commander something to shoot with. I mean, other than the entire tank. We will use part C16 here, which is shaped such that it will hang off the machine gun ring nicely. Part C20, which is some kind of rack that will hold this. Part C51, the machine gun, which I believe is a lovely little model of an MG34. Let me know in the comments if that's not actually an MG34. Assembly is fairly simple. Put part C16 anywhere on the gun ring you want it. I've decided my commander has been mowing down Yanks or Brits or something off to the right of the tank before he must have got bored and ducked back inside. Next, glue the frame part into place. You'll find this part wants to fall down because gravity hates us all, so prop it up with something and leave it to set. Then the machine gun can be glued into position, or it would be if I were not leaving it off for painting later. Surprise, surprise. It does look pretty cool though. Next, I glue the gun mantlet to the front of the turret. This is keyed, but you can still put it in upside down. You want the part with the hole where the mantlet flares out a little bit to sit on the right side of the tank, or the left if you're looking at it from the front. Then I glue the gun into the mantlet. This is also keyed to ensure that you don't put the gun in with the muzzle brake all wonky. Nobody likes a wonky muzzle brake. Nobody. And that's the turret completed. I think it looks pretty good. Certainly more complete than the hull with all its missing parts. Onwards to step 16. Attached turret. Well, okay, I'll give it a go. Okay, so this is pretty simple. I don't think anyone needs instructions on how to do this. Step 16 also says to heat some sprue and stretch it to form an antenna, but I'm not going to bother with that. I know it will just break off the second I bump the model or try to store it on a small shelf. What I am going to do though is make a little cable for the headlight. No part for this was included in this kit, but I've seen many pictures of King Tigers with this cable, so I figured why not try my hand at bending some wire and making one, just as a nice little extra touch. I believe it should run up from the lamp and over to this little lumpy thing here. The first thing I want to do is create a bend to join to the lamp itself and then run up the slope of the armor. I take a guess at how far I want to bend it and get lucky. It's almost perfect the first go. Then I cut the end that joins to the lamp so it will fit. Easy enough so far. Then I mark where I want to make the second bend to come up over the edge of the front of the armor and down onto the roof of the hull and make another bend, which is simple enough. It is blurry, but it does fit. We then need to bend about 90 degrees downwards, and I spent the next 10 minutes or so trying to get the rest of the bends right, with a little bit of frustration. I probably should have used a thinner brass rod. Also, I don't really have the appropriate tools to do this kind of thing properly. Oh well. I did manage to end up with something that looks just about right. A little bit dinged up and scratched from repeated bending, but not too bad. I applied superglue using a toothpick to avoid spreading it around too much, though I did still make a bit of a mess with it because I also applied it to the part and wasn't satisfied with the position, so I moved it around a bit too much. Eventually, I did get it into a place I was happy with. It's not perfect, but I like it more than having no cable at all. The mess from the glue should be less obvious with paint, and we could disguise it as dirt if we need to. Next, I fixed a couple of spots with green stuff. This is pretty simple, and I'm sure you don't need me to add to the length of this video with green stuff tutorials. I filled the gaps here at the front of the hull where the hull sides join and protrude up past the front plate. It does look a little bit rough, but I figured that might look like dirt and gunk has accumulated there when painted. I also filled this gap along the bottom of the hull rear, even though it probably won't be so noticeable. And I added a tiny bit between the brass rod and the lamp part because it looked a bit rough and jagged where the parts came together. The rest of the steps in the instructions are to do with building the motorcycle. I'm not going to be building that unless for some reason people request it, so leave a comment to let me know if you want to see that. I just don't feel a need for the motorcycle. I'm not going to be making a diorama with it or anything like that. So that is the completed 1/35th scale King Tiger Ardennes front plastic kit by Tamiya. Well, mine's not so complete at this stage, but I have temporarily attached the parts that I'm going to leave off for painting just to give a better idea of what it should look like. Sans tracks, of course. I didn't really feel it was worth the effort to try and loose fit those. I may yet still buy some aftermarket tracks. If I do, I will of course demonstrate them in a video. Some of the temporarily attached parts are held in place with blue tack, so if you're wondering what those grey blobs are, it's blue tack. I have really enjoyed putting this model together. It's something a little different to the models I usually build, and I'm certainly going to do more kits in this scale in the future. Build time was about 3 hours and 30 minutes in short bursts over the space of about a week and a half. That does include time spent removing parts from the sprues, cleaning mold lines so there were very few that needed much work at all, and of course test fitting the parts, which is important. I'm sure it could be done much quicker, but it is good to just take your time and work carefully with a kit like this. Though I suppose you can say the same for any kit, really. This model kit was really easy to put together. The instructions are clear and easy to follow. The only issue I had was that some of the parts were quite tiny. Mostly I was worried I might lose them, so it's not really a problem with the kit. I am of course not an expert on tank accuracy and details, but I think this is a pretty good representation of a King Tiger. It's a very well detailed and crisp looking model. I think it's going to look really nice once I get it painted. I will of course film that process and share it here at some point in the future. I'm not entirely sure when, but I am quite excited to start working on it. I would have already started, but I've run out of primer. Rest assured, work will begin soon. I probably won't be building another kit in this scale too soon, though I do have a few 1/35th scale kits on my shelf that look like they might be a bit more challenging and fun to build. When I do build them, they will be chosen by supporters on Patreon. At a certain point, I will start having polls for patrons to take part in, and the first will be choosing what tank I build in this scale next. I'm not going to tell you what the choices are just yet. I would like to know what you guys think of this build video. Want me to build the motorcycle? Was the video too in-depth? Not in-depth enough? I know it's pretty long, so thanks if you've stuck around this far. Your feedback would be appreciated in the same place any comments, questions, or suggestions usually go, the comment section. If you like the videos I make, be sure to click like and share with anyone that might also like them. And of course subscribe here and at my original Herbert Erpaderp channel, a link for which you will find in the description. And if you really like what I do, or you want to vote for my next 1/35th scale tank, or you want a personalised thank you card, then please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/HerbertErpaderp, or follow the link in the description. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video, found it interesting or helpful. Thanks for watching. Farewell.